Welcome. I'm Peter Budnick, the president and chair of the Wethersfield Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the next installment of Rooted, Cultivating a Green Philosophy, where we consider responsible farming and stewardship practices that might care for our environment and ecology while also prioritizing the interests and needs of local farmers and communities. The Wethersfield Institute is thrilled to be working with the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation in this series. Through our founder, Chauncey Stillman, we have a rich legacy in developing themes of agricultural, artistic, intellectual, cultural, and Catholic. The Wethersfield Institute was pleased to call Sir Roger a friend in the last few years of his life and enjoyed memorable several days in the early autumn of 2018 when he visited the Wethersfield farm and estate and enjoyed all the fruits of Chauncey Stillman's physical legacy, even participating in the equestrian heritage of the area. In 2019, Sir Roger contributed to the preface of Land and Liberty, The Best of Free America, a collection of essays on agricultural and decentralization, edited by Alan C. Carlson, published by the Wethersfield Institute. We're grateful for the continued friendship of the Scruton Legacy Foundation and are looking forward to deepening the contribution that Chauncey Stillman and Sir Roger Scruton made toward our understanding of being rooted in both time and place. This series is a beautiful tribute to the legacy of both men. With that, I give you your Rooted series host, Grace Olmstead, the author of Uprooted, Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. She has written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, among other outlets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and welcome everyone. As Peter said, my name is Grace Olmstead, and I have the immense privilege of serving as your host as we walk through this series together. In this series, we are considering what it means to steward local ecology and local communities well, and to address the crises of climate change, rampant waste, soil degradation, and water pollution through a particular lens. We face dire environmental challenges in our time. How do we respond to these challenges? How do we make a difference? Sir Roger Scruton suggested in his book, Green Philosophy, that rootedness and a love of home must be at the center of our approach to these challenges. Thus far, we have talked to Mary Berry of the Berry Center and to author and farmer James Rebanks about the ways in which their love of home and place have animated their work and inspired their efforts at ecological stewardship. Our continuing conversations will explore both practical and philosophical approaches to questions of stewardship and creation care, questions of being in the world and of living well. Professor Norman Wirzba is, I think, an indispensable guide and thinker on these questions, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk to him today. He is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology at Duke Divinity School and Senior Fellow at the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. His research is centered on a recovery of the doctrine of creation and a restatement of humanity in terms of its creaturely life. His publications include Agrarian Spirit, Cultivating Faith, Community, and the Land, Living the Sabbath, Discovering the Rhythms of Rest and Delight, From Nature to Creation, A Christian Vision for Understanding and Loving Our World, Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating, and many, many other wonderful books. Professor Wirzba serves as a general editor for the book series Culture of the Land, a series in the New Agrarianism published by the University Press of Kentucky, and is co-founder and executive committee member of the Society for Continental Philosophy and Theology. So we are going to talk for approximately 35 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So I would love for all of our attendees to think of questions that they might like to ask and then add them to the Q&A box. You can just type in a comment there and we'll address those once we get to that Q&A time. Dr. Wirzba, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's lovely to be with you, Grace. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, I'm so glad that we get to have this conversation. It's been interesting and fun as I've read and reread your books. Oftentimes I'll discover these new thinkers or philosophers that mean a lot to me. And then I'll go back to your works and realize you've been quoting them for decades. And so I rediscover them through your work as I return to it. But I would love to start with a question that we asked both Miss Berry and Mr. Rebanks as we were talking to them. How would you describe your environmental ethic? What values or principles undergird your vision of ecological stewardship?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I got early on in my career asked to teach environmental ethics and philosophy because I studied philosophy in graduate school, and I was not very happy with the way environmental ethics was being presented. It was mostly working with modern philosophers like Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill. And I thought this is not so helpful. And then I also realized that in American environmentalism, the wilderness ethos became sort of the benchmark by which to think about our relationship to the land. And so I thought here we have two approaches to the question of environment that are not very satisfying because, first of all, the modern philosophical framework was, I thought, not very encompassing of people living with other creatures. And then the wilderness ethos presumes that people don't belong. You can visit, but you're not supposed to live there. And what changed for me was meeting Wendell Berry and becoming friends with he and Tanya and learning about agricultural traditions. I had grown up farming, but I didn't make the connection that agricultural traditions and practices might actually be the most fruitful way to talk about environmental ethics, because these are people who have lived on the land, from the land, through the land, and so they surely are in the best position to teach us how to live responsibly or how to live in ways such that we don't, exploit the land to the detriment of fellow creatures, but then ultimately to the detriment of us. And so these agricultural traditions that are deep and wide and diverse because they're all across the planet, I thought, have so much to teach us. And so a lot of what I do now when teaching environmental philosophy and ethics is I point people to farmers so we can see the history of their successes and the successes of their failures. And it's very much a way of thinking about the world that grows out of a way of life rather than just some ideas, is the way I put it now.
That's beautiful. And it's interesting to think about too the way in which that sort of embodied approach to what it means to live well in the world. It has this anthropological dimension. It has a very important philosophical dimension, but ultimately it also has to be lived out.
Yeah.
What does it mean, do you think? In several of your books, you write that a loving God made the world, and you underline the importance of that act of creation. You kind of separate out the importance of understanding the atmosphere and the world we live in as nature or as creation.
Mhm.
That these are fundamental terms to understanding what it means to live in the world. So why is it important in your mind to believe that God and that a loving God
Yeah,
created?
yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a really important question, I think, because we're living in a time, I think, when a lot of people are wondering, what kind of world are we in? And there are lots of reasons why that wonder is becoming evident, or maybe confusion is even a better way to describe it. Because when you think about how the development of modern economies and political forms has created, at least the dominant economic forms, has created a world in which we're finding many of our places uninhabitable or unwelcoming, not just to humans, but to multi-species life. And you have to think, what kind of enlightened thinking produces a world where we can't live in it, or where living in it has become dangerous or poisonous or what have you? This is a serious problem, and it reflects something about how perhaps having thought of the world as dead or as having no value until human beings come along and say, well, we have this economic value we're now going to assign to it. That suggests that we don't believe that the world really matters in and of itself, or that the world is really worthy of cherishing. And I think the language, even within environmental schools, is to talk about natural resources. And again, resources assumes that we've already commodified the world. And so I wanted to think, because, obviously as a theologian, but also someone who has studied religious traditions and indigenous cultures for some time, what you find in many of them, not all, but in many of them, is you find this idea that there's a creator and that the creator in making the world reflects an intention that when realized in the making of the world reveals the world to be good, to be desirable, or in Christian circles, certainly a world that is loved into being, right? It's not that God does this out of compulsion. It's not that God does this because God is bored. God creates the world because God loves for something other than God to be. And in making that world, sustaining that world, um, communicates to all of us that when you look at a creature, when you look at a place, you don't just see something that exists. You see something that exists because it is beloved. And once you recognize that the world that you inhabit is a world that is the embodied expression of that love, it changes your relationship to it. And you know, Robin Kimmerer, whose book Braiding Sweetgrass is, of course, read by so many people now, and I'm so glad it's the most wonderful book. She says, when we don't experience the land as a place where love is at work, or if we don't experience land as something that actually loves us through its creatures, through its fruitfulness, through its beauty, that creates a massive psychic disturbance in us. And I think that's certainly the case, because how do you value people? How do you value life if the world is treated as dead? I think that's a major problem. And so I'm hoping that as we recover these different themes about creation and the world being created and beloved, that might slowly alter the way we think about our relationship to non-human things.
Seems as if we have this tension, this tightrope between, on the one hand, wanting to envision the world without humanity,
Yeah.
wilderness untouched. And then on the other side, you have this approach that is very much focused on consumption and everything is a resource to be used up. How do we navigate that middle way? How have you found Wendell Berry's work and others kind of guiding us in a different approach to these questions?
Yeah. So in The Unsettling of America, Wendell has this wonderful line where he says the land is constantly passing through our bodies, right? So the idea that we could be a post-agricultural society is a fantasy. And it's a fantasy that's founded upon a fundamental dualism in which people don't think of themselves as fundamentally, inescapably, and beautifully embodied, right? And so if you think about the human being as embodied, you immediately realize that the notion that human beings don't belong, whether because it's wilderness and you're just a visitor, or you don't belong because you're a cancerous presence on the earth, both of those start with an assumption about what it means to be human that I think is false. One of the things that I believe modern medicine and science are teaching us is how intimately and intricately stitched into the world we are, especially when you get to the level of the microbiome, right? When you get to the level of the ingestion of food, when you get to the level of breathing, right? That these are all biophysical processes that make our bodies come out of the ground, literally, right? In the book of Genesis, there is a Garden of Eden story in which you have God on God's knees, holding soil in God's hands, breathing into it. I say kissing the soil, and out comes a human being. But also the plants and the animals, the same processes invoke there. And a lot of people want to write that off and say, "Oh, that's mythical thinking or a fairy tale that God would breathe a human life out of the soil." But what modern science is teaching us is that our physiology actually confirms that, right? There is no possibility of a human life divorced from soil because everything we need circulates through the soil, most basically in forms of plant life that then give us fruits and vegetables, but also oxygen. And obviously also many beautiful things like wood to make chairs and tables and flowers to behold and, you know, all the rest. So to think that we could ever have been separate from this reality called nature or creation is a fundamental deception. And I think urban life has exacerbated that because when you're living an urban life, particularly some forms of urban life, you can be so insulated from the realities of soil and plant and animal insect life. We live in weather, climate controlled spaces, and we mediate our existence through screens. And that gives us this sense of isolation, of disembodiedness. And I think what we need to figure out is how to instill in people a sense of their own embodiment and how that embodiment means that we have to then be deeply, intimately connected to the lives of so many other creatures and places.
It's such an interesting and important question too, because I think you hinted at Kant and the work of some Enlightenment philosophers, which many of us, not all of us, but many of us are steeped in without
Yes.
even realizing it. And there's a tradition there of Gnosticism or of dualism that's kind of present throughout a lot of the United States and kind of the European Western cultures that many of us are part of, that has this, you say, disembodied or ethereal elsewhere that it seeks
Right.
to emphasize rather than an embodied focus on the here and now. So I think you've already touched on this, but why should we resist this sort of thinking? And what is the alternative that we're kind of reaching for?
Yeah, no, that's such an important question because there's obviously a religious version of this, which is to say that spirituality consists of sort of focusing on your soul. That's the most important element. And then when we die, the body, which is the source of so much pain, trouble, conflict, whatever, that when we die, our soul can go to be in this perfect ethereal, disembodied realm, right? And I see that often in Christian circles in which I know something about. And that, of course, is the influence of Socrates on Christian traditions and on culture more generally, because if you've had a body that fails you regularly, or if you've had a body that's been shamed, you can understand why people want to say the body is the source of pain and discomfort. And I want to instead get away from it. I want to escape embodiment, right? So the impulse is real and it's to be respected because being in a body for a lot of people because of their weight or their orientation or their race or whatever gender, it isn't always a happy experience. But what I want to help people understand is that from a Christian point of view, bodies are temples of God. God becomes a human body, suggesting that the body is not the problem. It's the abuse of bodies that's the problem. And so the spirituality that is sort of up and away, escape from embodiment, is, I think, a profound distortion of Christian thinking and practice. But there's a non sort of religious version of the same thing, and we see it in transhumanism, where you find people who, again, for the sort of Socratic reasons I've already given, they think that the body is just the source of limitation as well as trouble. And so they're wanting to figure out how do we overcome all these limitations. And so there's talk about becoming more like a cyborg or downloading information platforms and doing all the rest. But it's again a similar kind of disdain for embodiment. And this comes very much more directly out of Enlightenment rationalist philosophies, which say the most important thing about human being is that you're a thinking being. And so they don't talk about the soul because that's sort of Neanderthal or primitive to talk about the soul, but they still want to highlight reason because reason is the super cool thing that human beings have. And so you get folks who are thinking, people like Ray Kurzweil, who what we want to do is reduce the human being to an information pattern that we can upload into varying forms of hardware that can then be repeated, duplicated, multiplied, and then sent all over the universe and live forever and ever. So you have a kind of spiritual immortality and then also a kind of techno immortality. And both of those are delusions because they don't understand, don't appreciate, take seriously our own embodiment. And that has been to the tremendous detriment of us, but also the world, because if we loved bodies, we would also have to love the land that feeds bodies. If we love bodies, we'd have to look at the neighborhoods and the housing of those bodies and to find out, are we honoring the bodies? Are we cherishing the bodies? Are we caring for those bodies? And the minute you ask that question, questions of land management, questions of food production, energy production, they all immediately come to the surface.
I always think too, it's interesting how there's an eschatological component of that as well, where do we think that eventually we are going to escape or leave this planet behind, or do we actually believe that everything we currently live in and experience is going to be fully
Yeah.
redeemed?
Yeah. Or there's the Mark Zuckerberg version I just read about where he's purchased thousands of acres in Hawaii and is building his bunker so that when the apocalypse comes, he will have insulated himself. And again, it's a crazy fantasy.
Mm. Oh, that
And
I
it,
didn't know that. That's
and it
interesting.
reflects a fundamental disdain, right? A disdain for this world, a disdain for fellow creatures and fellow people. Um, it's such a revolting approach to this world. But I guess once you get super wealthy, you can afford to do that.
It makes me think of the stories I've heard of Christians during the Black Plague in
Mm,
Europe, and the fact that in the midst of what was surely felt like an apocalyptic event,
right?
and people were fleeing cities en masse, what the response of many Christians was to stay and to tend and to nurse the
Right.
ill, even though it was really a death sentence to do
Yes.
so. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is the Christian response to apocalypse?
Oh my, how much time we got? Yeah, no. So, I mean, the simplest way that I approach it is actually to turn to the very end of scripture, Revelation, which is tricky because the book of Revelation has been used to underwrite all kinds of escapist fantasies and also even the degradation of the earth, right? Burn it up faster and then Jesus will return or whatever. But the thing I like to point out to people is that when you look at Revelation, the end of the book, you get a vision not of Christians fleeing this earth to be with God somewhere else. Instead, you get a vision of the heavenly city, right? The place where the life of God is dwelling, descending to earth. And when I tell students and people, what happens to all those people, all those Christians who have a spirituality that is up and away, and they think they're going to be with God, and then they see God coming the opposite direction, and God waves at them and says, "Why are you going away from the creation that I have only ever loved? Why are you going the wrong way? You got to come back here." Because as John says in the Apocalypse, that the home of God is among mortals, and that God wants to reside on earth with creatures. Now, that's an amazing flipping of the trajectory that you often find within Christian circles. And what that means is we now have to deal with the question, how are we preparing a welcoming place for God to come? Right. So the kind of apocalyptic vision that I talk about with people is not how do we escape this world, but how do we participate in God's redemption of this world, right? In gospel language, that's the kingdom of God. But more generally, it's how do you create a world in which the love of God is the only power activating our relationships with each other and with fellow creatures and with the earth? Because as the Christ hymn in Colossians puts it, what the work of Christ does, which is cosmic work, is it reconciles the whole of creation, everything, tapanta, all things in heaven and on earth, to God, right? That's the vision. And that means that heaven is not about your transportation to somewhere else. Heaven is about the transformation of this world so that it's only the love of God that is circulating as the animating power of all of our relationships. And to live in that world would be pretty amazing.
It would. It leads me into my next question I really wanted to ask you. Is our series is titled Rooted. And this is, I think, an important word and an important concept, but there are many different ways to understand it. So what do you
Sure.
think it means for us to be properly rooted humans?
Yeah. So if we just stick with the image of the root, first of all, right? One of the things that we imagine when we think of roots, we think of some tendrils going into soil and the soil then feeding the plant through those root fibers. And so the root is often imagined to be something like an extractive device. And I think that's a fundamentally mistaken notion of what roots are, because first of all, it doesn't have an appreciation for the whole plant, right? A plant is not just what's underground, hugely important, but also what's above ground. And what's happening above ground, of course, is that the plant is capturing sunlight and transforming sun power, sun energy into glucose that goes into the plant, goes down into the roots, and is distributed into the soil where it's feeding all sorts of microbes. And so the plant, rather than just being one more extractive device, is actually a conduit through which energy and food and nutrition flows back and forth constantly. And the more the roots go into the soil, the more it is able to be in conversation with this incredibly diverse microbial life that nurtures the plant, makes it a healthy plant, makes it a delicious plant. And at the same time, as the plant expands and grows into the sunlight, is able to capture more energy and bring that into the soil. And so for me, the question about what does rootedness do is it becomes this two-way conversation where it's not about what can you get from your place, as important as that is, because we all need nurture, but it's also what can you give to your place, because what you give to the place in return is that you strengthen the soil, the community, the neighborhood, whatever sort of the place is that is defining your existence. And so this mutual strengthening becomes the key to rooted life. And the mistake is to make that this idea that you can just come to a place, siphon what you want from it, and then move on somewhere else, right? Which has been sort of the pattern of settlement in many, many places around the world. This is why I think, the agrarian argument is so powerful. It's not about never being able to move. It's about coming to a place, figuring out what are the places, what are the features of the place that you're in that nurture life, because you're going to need those, but then also figuring out what can you do as someone who nurtures those nurturing sources in return. Because as we nurture each other, as we nurture our neighborhoods, our housing developments, right, our schools, our healthcare facilities, as we nurture those, we strengthen the possibility of all the life that moves through it. And so the shorthand definition that I always give now for what is an agrarian, it's not a farmer. An agrarian is someone who nurtures the places that nurture them, right? It's a person who nurtures the people that nurture them. And you do that in this whole embodied way, so that you're not just giving people hugs, but you're actually learning the skills you need to be a genuine help to them, to develop the skills you need to be a genuine help to your neighborhood, right? Those become the forms of transaction between yourself and your neighborhood so that you're no longer just sort of leaching out the good from a place.
So does that mean that an agrarian can in fact live in a city?
Oh, absolutely. And it needs to, right? Because the world is becoming more and more urban, right? Demographers tell us that, by the end of the century, 80% of all the world's people will be living in big cities. So the agrarian case does not depend on everybody becoming a farmer. That would be a dreadful idea, mostly because there isn't enough land, but then also basically most people aren't smart enough to do it, right? The caricature of farmers as being simpletons, this couldn't be further from the truth, because you have to know so much and you have to have such a diverse skill set. So even myself, having grown up farming, been around farming people for a long time, I've become stupefied by becoming a professor, because the range of skills that I have to exercise in my office just doesn't compare to the range of skills that a good farmer has to have, to grow plants, take care of animals, build buildings, repair equipment, right? It's an enormously complicated task. So, yeah, don't become a farmer as a city person. That's not your aspiration. Your aspiration as a city person is to say, what does my community need? What does my family need so that we can thrive well in our neighborhood, in our suburb, wherever it's going to be? And as you ask those really important questions with other people, I would say, you can begin to see things like, okay, we don't have enough playgrounds for kids, right? Or healthcare is just inadequate. So we got to find a way to get more healthcare providers into this region, because too many people are suffering from disease that suffering is needless. Or you're thinking about how we need to have more protections for our children. Or, I mean, there's just an unending number of questions that you can pursue. Do we have good, nutritious food, right? If we don't, how as a community are we going to nurture that source of food production that's going to be a real benefit to our community? So nurture wherever you are, that's nurturing you. That's the idea.
In your book, which I have right here, Agrarian Spirit, you have a quote in chapter 9, Learning to Hope, that I think captures this, and that was really thought-provoking for me. You write, when people ask me about the grounds for hope, I often ask them to think about the grounds for love. What do you love? Why do you love it? And what do you need to sustain your love? Insofar as you can find it in yourself to love a place, a community, or another human being, the question of hope turns to the very practical matter of what your particular love requires of you. To love your family or community requires you to work for the flourishing of each of its members by making sure their varying needs are met.
Yeah.
Which is a really lovely, I think, definition of agrarianism, and I think helps perhaps address one of the concerns that people might have when they hear the term agrarianism, which is this kind of a nostalgic vision, or is it, as you already pointed out, kind of wanting us all to turn back the clock? So how is agrarianism something that is both preserving and conserving and enriching what exists and kind of looking toward the future?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think on the one hand, we need the past, not because it's perfect, but because the past is the place of inherited wisdom and foolishness. Okay. We need to remember that the past is never all good. But insofar as the past is that place where we go to see the history of effort expended in pursuit of varying goals and ideals, we can do the important work of figuring out why did something work and why did something fail, right? So if you think just about agricultural communities, one of the reasons it's so hard for someone who wants to just start farming is that there's no community and no tradition that informs their practice. Yet you need neighbors, you need family members who say, that's a bad idea. Don't try to do that because we've tried it and the end result is no good. Okay. So you need the past as the history of learning where you can go and say, these are worthy objectives. These are maybe not worthy objectives. And these are practices that are really good. We know that they will be successful. And these are practices that will not. Right. So past is super important, not to go back to it, but to learn from it. Okay. And the history of successes is just as important as the history of failures. Now, in terms of going to the future, I mean, the future is by definition unknown, of course, but the world is changing in so many ways. And this is why we especially need the history of the past to determine whether or not we're going to have the skill sets we need to navigate uncertainty. And uncertainty, of course, is the kind of thing that scares us. And in some instances, it really should scare us because the unknown could portend something really terrible. Um, I'm thinking specifically today about AI. There's a lot of concern about whether or not artificial intelligence is going to, well, we know it's going to eliminate a number of jobs, but we also have the worry, a legitimate worry, about what AI is going to do to us as human beings, right? What we understand a human being to be. And for that, we absolutely need to learn from the past about where we see humanity most deeply affirmed, most deeply respected, most beautifully cultivated. And what we're going to discover when we do that look back is that the best of human flourishing has never simply been a focus on the soul, but it's been a focus on bodies, right? It's been a focus on developing quality relationships with other people, with fellow creatures. It's been about appreciating beauty and goodness. And those are things that AI has a lot of trouble with because AI is a mechanical platform that really works on a quantitative level rather than the level of quality. And so, when I've talked to students who express their concern about AI, I say we have to think then about what have been the best people to sort of alert us to what genuine humanity looks like. And we discover that they talk about characteristics like love and compassion, appreciation for beauty. And AI is not so helpful there because AI is about monetizing everything it touches and quantifying everything it touches. And people they quickly discern that they don't want to simply be a data set in somebody else's algorithm, right? And so this is an example about how the past can be used to help us think through some pretty uncertain territory and maybe give us enough of a cautionary principle by which to say, let's not be foolhardy and just embrace this, because we're going to have boosters who come along who really say AI is the future. And the reason they're saying that, of course, is because they're going to make a lot of money by getting more and more people committed to using AI.
It's a really fascinating question that I've been thinking about a lot too, and been in conversations about as AI just becomes more prevalent in our discourse and for students, I think. And something I've often found coming up in conversation is a question too about the ways in which perhaps there's a focus on consumption rather than creation when we are talking about AI and some of these new technologies. And I think going back to creation, if we believe we are made in the image of God, then we begin to see that we have this important and beautiful role as sub-creators. And so, in
Yeah.
fact, there are forms of work that we do and that we embrace, not because we will do them as well as AI. You know,
Yes.
maybe there will be a point where writing would be better if it was done by a robot. And yet, there's all sorts of beautiful work that we participate in because we are sub creators, and that's what we're called to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's really profound, Grace. And you know, sometimes when I talk about creativity with people, they immediately go the direction of, well, I'm not a painter like Van Gogh or whatever, or I'm not a musician like some of these people are who are famous. But I want to say, think about creativity in the much more mundane spaces of your life, like cooking, right? One of the great joys of cooking is you get to experience how delectable the world is. And by joining your love and skill to the nutrition and the flavors of a world and produce something that when you eat it and share it with other people creates so much joy, why would you not want to be a part of that? Right. And so creativity becomes humanity's participation in the unfolding of the world's beauty, the world's goodness. And I think why people often have this deep attachment and love for creative time is because we want to know that we're part of a world that when we participate in its development, we're contributing to the beauty and loveliness that's already there. And we can be complementing it, we can be highlighting it, and we can be adding to it, right? Those are amazing things to be able to do. And so creativity, I'm absolutely with you on that, is it's just this opportunity for us to do the kind of exploration that draws us into a deeper exploration of our world and the people, creatures we live with.
I need to remind folks to please share your questions in the Q&A box. We'll go ahead and start those in just a couple of minutes here, but maybe a couple other questions while we wait for those to come in. So I think one thing you've talked about that is fascinating is how the senses come to play in this. And there's a creative component, there's a virtue component when we talk about things like hope and love and gratitude and generosity. But we also interact with the world via these bodies. We are embodied beings. So what does it mean to see or to listen or to touch or to smell in such a way, to taste in such a way that we are encountering the world more fully and in a way that draws us into this pattern of well-being and of doing well that we are called to?
Yeah. Oh, there's a number of examples that I could give here, I think. So I love to work with wood, like to make things, build things, and did home construction for a while. But I don't do that anymore. But I do love to still make things out of wood. And so we needed a new kitchen table. It was too small. And I wanted to make a table and chairs. And so, I thought, well, what kind of wood would I like to use? And quickly settled on maple, but then discovered that there's this thing called wormy maple or ambrosia maple. It goes by a number of different names now. And the result of this wood results because insects get into the wood and they burrow in there and they create these little tunnels in the wood, but they leave these stains in the wood that are just gorgeous when you cut it. And so I bought a number of planks of this wormy maple and spent a lot of time. Maple's very hard wood, so you got to be pretty patient and it takes time. But when you work with it well, it creates like a marble finish on top. So smooth, buttery smooth almost. And so now every time I sit down to eat at that table, I don't just see the table, I feel the table. And I have the memory in my body of working with that table. And what it's done is it has made me so appreciative of a world that can produce maple trees and bugs that in their coming together produce something like this. And I think a sadness for me is that so many people don't have that experience of through their engaged labor and participation in a world, they don't really have a sense for how the world is constantly presenting us with these beauties. And I'm not opposed to buying things, not at all. But if everything that you have in your home is only ever purchased, you often get the reflection of somebody else's interest in your money rather than somebody else's interest in making something that reveals the beauty of our life together or the beauty of the world.
Oh, I love that. My husband loves working with wood as well. And I've noticed a difference in just our home and rhythms when we are using or sitting around these things that he's made. Um,
Yeah.
it's a powerful thing.
Well, and the
Unexpected.
other thing I would add to that is when you have something that you've made or somebody's made for you, the thing isn't just a thing. It's also an expression of the person's devotion in the making of the thing or the person's love for you in making it and giving it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think so many people, when they look out on the world, they see a world that does not reflect that kind of cherishing, that kind of devotion. And so it's just stuff. And that's really sad if everything you engage is just stuff.
We have a question very much related to this, I think. What are some daily practices that can help reorient us to our embodied nature? How can we model care for or teach our children to care for their place?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Um, I think I would start by saying, because so many of us live in worlds that are very, very fast paced, right? We're all busy. I'm certainly guilty of all that. There is this need to be attentive to where you are, who you are with, what you are with, because things never simply are their surface appearance. Okay. And when you go through life very quickly, you don't get past the surface. So even something like a meal, you sit down and you say, well, that's just oatmeal. And, maybe I've got some good toppings I can put on it and I eat it as quickly as possible because I got to get on with my day. And so a good practice to do is to say, stop for a minute and contemplate the oatmeal in the bowl in front of you and ask yourself, what's the story behind the coming to be of this oatmeal? Because if you ask that question with any kind of seriousness, you may discover first you have no idea what the story is behind that oatmeal. But if you do a little bit of investigating, you discover, well, that means you grow oats. And oats are a grain, and grains require soil, and they require fertile soil, and they require agricultural communities that grow oats. And suddenly, what was just this product, commodity, becomes instead something like a story that you now can participate in which you can say, is the agricultural or the food system that produced this oatmeal, how is it honoring the life of the soil, the life of the agricultural community? And that gives a kind of depth to the world that is often missing. And I think what happens when people start asking about their food and they realize that there's a lot of food that doesn't have a very good backstory, they can make the changes and say, well, I might, go buy from a farmer or go to a farmer's market and shake the hand and learn the story from the farmer who's actually growing that food. And so when you eat that oatmeal, you're now thinking about a particular farmer, right? Or you're thinking about a particular farm. And that gives a kind of depth and richness to the eating that you do. And it opens up the world to a much richer array of meaning than just, a bowl of porridge.
One other thing that comes to mind, especially with children, because I have three littles right now, and this is something we think about a lot with them. I would just say too, or add that gardening has been such a rich way to help them see their connections to where we live, and to the world. And I think there's something really beautiful about the 18-month-old who waddles out into the garden and just grabs tomatoes off the vine and eats them, and is living out that sort of taste and see relationship to God's goodness in that moment. And
Yeah,
then eventually learns to plant their own things and to grow their own food. And I've experienced that as a way to help them connect deeply. And then the other one would be walking with them, doing less driving and more walking.
yeah,
They are tiny noticers. And I think as they get to know their neighborhoods or the places that you live in, with their own 2 feet, they learn to love it and care for it and attend to it in a way that they just can't, and that we can't as adults if we're just in cars all the time.
that's right. Yeah. My wife had this wonderful line when we had our kids that were little, because you'd go for a walk with them and it means you can never walk in a straight line, right? Because kids are noticing everything, right? There's a bee, right? And suddenly you're off running to try to catch the bee or something like that. And it's this sense of wonder in the face of a world that is truly marvelous.
Mhm.
And for adults to have been weaned away from that kind of spontaneous exuberance in the face of others is a very sad thing.
That reminds me of, we went on a walk with our nature journals one time, and I made the mistake, you could say, as an adult might say it was a mistake, of saying, now we're going to stop whenever you notice something beautiful that you want to draw, and we'll just stop and we'll draw. We did not make it past 2 houses. We were stopping every 5 steps and drawing something, and just plopping down on the sidewalk, sitting there and drawing. And so it was a beautiful kind of example to me of what it means to truly glory in whatever is right in front of you. And I learned an important lesson, in that
Yeah,
day.
that's wonderful.
We have another question. What do you think the role of Christian faith is in ecological conservation work when lots of people don't take Christianity seriously? How do we bridge beliefs in order to collaborate at this increasingly urgent time for the planet and for humanity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first thing to say is Christians have to be honest with themselves and with each other in admitting that they have often, through their institutional forms of faith, been the problem, right? Because they have, in many instances, blocked efforts that are geared towards conservation and have done it for what I think are really pretty dreadful reasons. Sometimes it's because they think that the point of faith is to get your soul to heaven. Bodies don't matter, the world doesn't matter, and that maybe even God hates the world, which is a pretty horrifying thing to say. And I think sometimes too, Christians have to be clear in saying that in matters of environment, they've just capitulated to the culture around them, right? They've not taken seriously their own faith as a way to think more deeply, more carefully about why we are called to care for the earth. I mean, it starts right in the beginning of Scripture when God creates the human being out of the soil and then says, take care of the soil. That's the first thing to say to the human being by God is take care of the garden. And taking care of the garden is not a punishment. Taking care of the garden is God's invitation to us to join in God's gardening ways with the world, which are ways of nurture and protection and celebration and so forth. So that's something I would say, and we could spend a lot of time talking about what's within Christian traditions and theology that can sort of underwrite that care of each other and the care of our world. But just last week I was with my colleague Abdullah Antepli, an Islamic imam, a Muslim imam who teaches here at Duke with me, and just we brought together 25 faith leaders, community leaders from around the world, all these different faith traditions, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and it was just amazing because the reality is that, yes, a lot of people think that everybody's secular, but that's just not true. Historically speaking, we're seeing that religions are growing. They're not decreasing. It's just smaller enclaves that think atheism is the way to be. But they're expressing their faith in new kinds of ways, right? They're not just happy with all the inherited forms. And so what we did with these 25 faith leaders is we're saying, you are leaders of communities and you are in a position to do the important work of bringing a moral voice, a spiritual voice to the table, where in policy circles, for instance, you can get IPCC reports, you can get the Paris Accords, you can get all these different sort of bureaucraties, kinds of ways of addressing climate change without realizing that what we really need to be talking about is what's most important about this world? What's most important about our life? How do we know when life is successful? And religious traditions, they are the carriers of a deep description, a deep exploration of what makes life good, what makes life valuable. When does life go off the rails, right? And there's a lot of common ground there. What makes life good is that it's a gift. What makes life go off the rails is when you become selfish or when you develop habits of hatred, right? These are shared amongst many, many traditions. And so the conviction that Abdul and I have is that as we can activate faith communities, not by getting into the details of all the doctrines and teachings and all that, those are important, but we don't want to get to the level of disputes. We want to get to the level of our shared loves, our shared concerns, because it's not enough in this time of climate change to say there's all these things you can't do anymore and therefore present it as a life of deprivation. Instead, you have to talk about these are the qualities that we seek as people who have thought carefully about why life even matters. And we want to cultivate love. We want to cultivate peacefulness. We want to cultivate harmonious living, right? Because those are beautiful. And they are the things that people, when they're saying with themselves, it's what people really want anyway. Okay. I don't know many people who at the end of retirement say, man, I sure wasted my life by spending too much time with my kids. It's the reverse, right? I wasted my life because I forgot my kids, is often the response you get. And so turning people to relationships and quality relationships is something that faith traditions have constantly been trying to help us understand and live into. And that's the positive vision that I think still needs to be communicated when we're in a time of climate change where there are a lot of bad things coming for sure.
Here's a question from a produce farmer who writes, I find it discouraging that so many in our society want cheap food. As a Christian and a farmer, what can be done to help people think about this more holistically without turning them off by being preachy or sanctimonious?
Yeah, yeah. I wish there was a simple solution. I think um, one thing to do is that we have to be more honest with each other about the true costs of food and realize that the forms of cheap food that we see or inexpensive food are not actually cheap because there are so many costs associated with respect to the health of land, the health of animals, the well-being of farming communities, but then certainly also the health of our own bodies. And so that we know the industrial sort of food system that depends upon making everything as cheap as possible um, has been the most ill healthy diet in the history of the world. Right? We just need to be clear about that. And then I think we also need to be clear with fellow eaters that there are some players in the food space who are making a lot of money off of the cheap food, right? And of course, we're talking about the food corporations and the farm corporations that sell the inputs and the machinery and the insurance and all of these things. They're making a lot of money. Farmers are not. And, the fact that so many people don't know anything about how food comes to be on their plates means that if we're going to help people come to an honest appreciation for what food really costs, we have to educate ourselves and each other about the food system. And I think if you do that, and you don't have to do that in a preachy way, do it in an exploratory way, right? As you do that, people might start to say, "Oh, yeah, that 99-cent bottle of Coke, uh, yeah, it's cheaper than a bottle of water, but hey, wait a minute, why do we have to buy water in the first place? Why are we polluting so much water? Why can't we just use tap?" I mean, all sorts of questions emerge when we talk about it with each other.
It's interesting too, thinking about what happened in the COVID pandemic and the breakdown of our pipelines of distribution and packaging and processing of food,
Yeah.
um, and many of which help to make that food cheap, because of their efficiency and the way in which they've been built, but they are not resilient. And so it was interesting, I think, in 2020, seeing a lot of people who were able to, finding alternative sources of food. And then some of those those middle players, regional packing houses, regional
Yeah.
um, slaughterhouses, things like that, kind of popping up in response to that. And so I think even helping folks think about what does it mean to build a food system that is resilient, so that we aren't always planning for perfection or for the best case scenario, but we are really
Right.
mindful of the fact that things can break down with an extremely efficient system, and we need something that serves communities better.
Yeah,
And
I totally agree with you.
so let's go ahead, and I think I just have one final question for you. We've been asking, we asked James Rebanks last time, what are you reading right now? What's on your desk?
Yeah, I always have multiple books on my desk, but one of the things that I'm working on right now is thinking about climate change in the context of a university. It's pretty clear that the inherited frames by which we think about things have got us into a lot of trouble. So I'm constantly looking for people who are writing from the margins, who are giving us different imaginations for what a world could be. And so right now I'm reading a number of indigenous writers. I'm reading a person named Daniel Wildcat, wrote a book called Red Alert, which is a book about what indigenous traditions have to teach us about the way we approach science, the way we approach technology. And he has this wonderful new term that I'd never heard before called indigenuity, which is a great way of talking about indigenous insights. So Daniel Wildcat is somebody I'm reading. And then also I'm reading Ned Blackhawk's Rediscovery of America. I think it was National Book Award that he just recently won with that book. But it's a look at American history through the eyes of how indigenous peoples understand what happened in those histories, which in many ways is producing insights about the story of America that are really profound, and need to be known more widely. So those are two books that I'm working on right now, along with some fiction, but it's really good.
I find I mentioned this before we started. I will oftentimes kind of discover a writer who's been around for ages, but I just haven't read their work yet, like Anne Formantel and The Power of Gentleness, or
Mm. She's wonderful, isn't she?
she is, or Maximus the Confessor, kind of discovering some of these thinkers who I just haven't read yet, and I'll fall in love with their work. Dr. Willie Jennings, and then I'll reread one of your books and be like, "You quoted them 20 times. How did I miss this the first time I read your book?" So I need to know your current book list so I can catch up.
All right. Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for all your insights. It's been a delightful conversation.
Oh, thank you, Grace. It's a pleasure being with you.